Hey everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to Rating 101. Today we're going to be talking about rotations and greed. Now when I talk about greed, I'm not talking about people being greedy about loot and that kind of stuff, but I am talking about rotational greed, so to speak. Now when it comes down to rotations, there are two big parts that you have to look at. On one hand, you as the player have your own rotation depending on the job that you play. Certain jobs have a very set in stone rotation that is basically fixed GCDs at all times. Other jobs are a little bit more fluid and follow a certain guideline, like for example a red mage, because they do build up their gauge, then spend it on their melee combo, but when they're building up their gauge they have to take into account their procs and that kind of stuff, and it kind of deviates every time. A bard is another good example of that, where they rotate through their 3 songs, but their rotation is going to slightly differ every time depending on the procs that they get and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, pretty much every job has a kind of rotation that they follow, and they try to loop this rotation for the most part as well, because looping is very important in this game, because it means that your burst windows stay aligned with other people's burst windows, and that also all of the raid buffs stay aligned as well, and thus meaning that everybody is doing their burst windows underneath those raid buff windows as well. So that's why kind of your rotation is very important, and that is something that you learn very well, and it's something that I'll also talk about later down the line in this video on how you can start practicing that one. And on the other hand, we also have a boss rotation. The boss itself has a bunch of mechanics that usually follow a certain timeline, and then by the time that this timeline reaches its end, the boss will cast their enrage and thus wipe the boss. So the basic principle of what you want to be doing during a raid is you want to try and kill the boss before the boss kills you in the end. Basically try to kill the boss before they cast their enrage, and of course in order to do that you want to do as much damage as possible, and that is where playing greedy comes into play. So let's first start off with your own personal rotation. Where should you go to practice this? How should you practice this? And what other things can you use for that? So first of all, we have a Discord channel called the Balance Discord, which is a really good way to start. Usually whenever I pick up a new job, or where for example a rework happens or a new expansion comes out or something like that, and I want to pick up something new, I usually head over to the Balance Discord to check in their specific guides. I have a bunch of good guides out there. Usually what I'm there for the most part is for the openers, because an opener basically sets up the rest of your rotation depending on what opener that you use, because your off-global cooldowns and such will be in different places depending on which opener that you use. Now if you want to go and practice your opener, it's of course very important that you can pretty much execute this one every single time. There is a really cool place called the Stone Sky Sea. Stone Sky Sea is found right outside of Yulmore if you're going for Shadowbringer stuff, and what it basically is it puts you up against a striking dummy. You get 3 minutes time to beat the DPS check on the striking dummy, so it's really good to practice your opener and to practice like basically the first 3 minutes of your rotation, because it basically also resets all of your cooldowns. So if you fail the DPS check, or say for example you just want to practice your opener, you go in there, all your cooldowns are reset, you do your opener, maybe you made some mistakes, you just run away from the striking dummy, queue in again to Stone Sky Sea, and all your cooldowns are back. So if you for example say something like a Dragoon or a Summoner that have very long 3-minute cooldowns on, for example, Battle Litany and Devotion and that kind of stuff, then you can just press your buttons, you failed your opener, go back outside, go back inside, and everything is ready for you again. Now the reason why Stone Sky Sea is not very good when it comes down to practicing your rotation is because it has that 3-minute maximum time limit, and also if you are like for example over geared at this point, like for example a lot of people are getting gear from Savage and from their weekly tombstone capping and that kind of stuff, that means that you'll probably beat the challenge in a shorter time than those 3 minutes as well, meaning that you get even less time to practice your rotation. So when it comes down to practicing rotations, you want to of course learn to loop your rotation and that kind of stuff, and then the 3 minutes of Stone Sky Sea is not enough. So Stone Sky Sea, really good to practice your opener because it constantly resets your cooldowns as you re-enter, not good to practice your rotation. If you want to practice your rotation, you can stay in Colusia if you want. In the first Atra that you come across as you enter Colusia, there are some striking dummies. You can use those to go fight, or you can just like go into the housing district and fight a striking dummy in the yard of somebody else or something like that if you want to do that. Or if you have an house yourself, you can of course just put a striking dummy there. That is a much better place for you to practice rotations, because you can basically hit the striking dummy for as long as you would like. Usually whenever I try to practice a rotation, look at what your looping is. So for example, for Gunbreaker loops every 3 minutes, so maybe do 9 minutes or something like that on the striking dummy. For example, Ninja is 2 minutes, so you just do, let's say, 8 minutes or something like that. And then take a look at your parser or something if you have ACT to see how you're improving. Or of course, you can kind of get a feel for it as well. Like for example, when you're not hitting your stuff on cooldown, or when your burst windows all of a sudden start looking a little bit weird, you know that you made a mistake somewhere. And that is where basically practicing your rotation can be really helpful, because that makes it so that when you go into a fight, you already know the fundamentals of what you should be doing when it comes down to dealing damage. Of course, this is mainly important for your DPS because that is their main job, but of course, tanks are pretty much DPS at this point as well, with some defensive cooldowns. And when it comes down to healers, there is a lot more optimization to be done there with your co-healer and that kind of stuff. And they also don't really have a set in stone rotation, because they just have a spammable DPS button and a damage over time action and that kind of stuff. So a lot more different when it comes down to healers, but for tanks and DPS players, like finding a rotation or learning your rotation is a lot more important. Now, of course, learning a rotation on a dummy is one thing, executing it on a boss fight is another, because a boss of course has mechanics, means that you might have to disengage from the boss, means that you might not be able to hit your positionals. If you're a caster, it might mean that you have to interrupt your casts here or there because you have to move out of an AoE or something like that, and that might mean that your rotation gets delayed, because of course you might have to like disengage from the boss and you can't hit that extra GCD. Or for example, the boss disappears for a few seconds, like for example look at E6 Savage. Whenever Ifrit drops down, you lose 1 or 2 GCDs there. When they combine together into Raktapaska, or Watermelon Man, as someone in my comments called it, then you're losing a few seconds again, and you might have to like do some other things to realign yourself with your rotation or something like that. So handling downtime will be something that you will have to learn from fight to fight. Of course, because every fight has different downtime and that kind of stuff. Some fights have short downtime. For example, something like Shiva has like over a minute of downtime where you lose all of your buffs and that kind of stuff. And you have to do like a re-opener when you come back to her. So different fights, different downtime, different mechanical rotations. Now, this is where greediness comes into play. So playing greedy basically means trying to get that extra GCD, trying to still hit that positional, trying to finish that cast before you move out of the AoE or something like that. And this will usually get people killed. This will most likely get you killed. This might even wipe the raid. A very good example, for example, when it comes down to me, would be my Ninja. Our Ninja, I think, is a great player when it comes down to dealing damage, but he has wiped us a lot of times on Light Rampant. Now, our Light Rampant strat is pretty bad when it comes down to melee uptime. We decided to keep it because it was very consistent in our group, but when he tried to learn how to keep uptime during this, he of course wiped the group a lot because he made a lot of mistakes, which is only normal because he's trying to do something that is not really that easy to do with this strategy that we are using. But on the other hand, now that he has been playing so greedy for however long it took him to learn it, now all of a sudden, when we get to Light Rampant, instead of him being on the other side of the map using his throwing daggers, he can now stay close to the boss, and he knows exactly when he needs to move out to not get hit by certain mechanics and still keep his uptime basically during this and lose the least amount of damage as possible, because this is a very important thing when you are going for a first raid clear or something like that. You basically need to get all the damage that you can get. Of course, as time gets, like over time, you get more gear and that kind of stuff, so the DPS check becomes easier and easier as time goes on. But of course, if you're trying to go for a week 1 clear, or even if you're playing with players that are not on the top of their game or something like that, every little bit of damage that you can get is always going to help you out, because it will also mean that people can make mistakes. When it comes down to doing a minimum item level fight, you basically can't really afford mistakes and everybody needs to be on the top of their game. But then as you get more gear and stuff like that, as people learn to do damage more as well, that means that maybe someone might die, or you can get a damage down stack or here or there, and you'll still meet that enrage, you'll still meet that DPS check. So that's why playing greedy is something that on one hand can be very annoying, because of course as you are learning to adapt to these mechanics to basically push out as much DPS as is possible, you are going to be dying, you are going to be wiping the raid in certain scenarios, like for example on Light Rampant, one mistake and everybody dies pretty much. So it can be very frustrating, but on the other hand, once you are getting consistent on that mechanic, once that person that is playing greedy knows the utter limit to which they can go to, it means that all of a sudden they know the exact rotation that they are doing, they know the exact mechanical rotation that is happening from the boss, and it means that they know just how far they can go without having like basically failing the mechanic. So they know exactly when to move out, they know exactly how many GCDs they can get before they have to disengage or something like that. And that in the long run will not only improve your own personal play because you know just how far you can go, you know where the limits are, but on the other hand, it also makes it easier for you to meet a DPS check because you're now doing more damage, and it also means that people might have to make, or basically are allowed to make some mistakes, like getting some damage downs or dying here or there, because you are now doing more damage. So that's why playing greedy, on one hand, it is very useful if you're learning it when you are progressing through a fight. Of course, once you have learned to fight and that kind of stuff, playing greedy is not as important anymore because you don't need to find the limits anymore because you already know what they are and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of something to think about. On one hand, learn your rotation, learn all of the basics of your job. Then when you go into a fight, apply that rotation onto the boss and see how much of that striking dummy rotation you can replicate on a boss that is doing mechanics. Try to stay as close to that dummy rotation as you can by playing relatively greedy at the start, and then once you find out the limits of the boss fight, find out how far you can go with each mechanic, then you start to disengage and play a little bit more safe, because now you know what is too much and what is just barely enough or barely possible and that kind of stuff. So that's pretty much gonna be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any more questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.